The stagecoach lurched to a violent stop outside the dusty town of Deer Lodge, Montana Territory, and Grace Turner knew from the whispers inside that her reputation had already arrived before her. 3 women clutched their bags tighter and pressed themselves against the opposite wall of the coach, their eyes wide with fear as they stared at her like she carried death itself in her worn carpetbag. "Cursed," one of them hissed to another. 3 husbands dead before their time. The devil's own bride, they say. Grace kept her chin high, though her heart ached with the familiar sting of accusations she could never escape. She was 22 years old, a widow 3 times over through no fault of her own, and desperate enough to answer an advertisement for a mail-order bride in the Montana Territory. Anything to leave behind the pointing fingers and cruel gossip of St. Louis. The driver opened the door, and the other women practically tumbled over themselves to exit first, leaving Grace alone in the coach. She took a steadying breath, smoothed down her plain gray traveling dress, and stepped out into the bright June sunshine of 1878. The mountain air was crisp and clean, so different from the humid thickness of Missouri. Deer Lodge sprawled before her, a frontier town that had grown around the territorial prison and the mining opportunities in the surrounding mountains. False-fronted buildings lined the main street, and cowboys, miners, and townsfolk moved about their business. Grace clutched her carpetbag and the leather satchel containing all her worldly possessions, and looked around for the man who was supposed to meet her. Gerald Sutton, the rancher who had answered her carefully worded advertisement with surprising kindness in his letters. She had been honest with him, perhaps too honest. She had told him about her first husband, Thomas, who had died when his horse threw him just 2 months after their wedding. About William, her second husband, who had succumbed to pneumonia within the year. About Charles, who had been struck by lightning while working in the fields only 6 months into their marriage. She had told Gerald that people called her cursed, that they said any man who married her was signing his death warrant. His response had been simple and direct. "I don't believe in curses. I believe in hard work, faith, and second chances. If you're willing to build a life out here in Montana, I'm willing to take whatever risk folks think you bring." Those words had given her the first spark of hope she had felt in 2 years. "Miss Turner." A deep voice drew her attention, and Grace turned to see a man approaching from across the street. He was tall, well over 6 feet, with broad shoulders that spoke of years of hard labor. His face was weathered and tanned from the sun, with lines around his eyes that suggested he smiled often. Those eyes were a striking gray blue, like storm clouds over the mountains, and they looked at her with an openness that made her breath catch. He was perhaps 27 or 28, with dark hair that curled slightly at the edges beneath his worn Stetson. "Mr. Sutton?" she asked, her voice steadier than she felt. He removed his hat and gave her a respectful nod. "Gerald, please. It's good to finally meet you, Miss Turner. I hope the journey wasn't too difficult." "Grace," she said quietly. "And the journey was manageable, thank you." She watched his face carefully, waiting for the moment when someone would whisper in his ear, when the warmth in his expression would turn to fear or suspicion. But Gerald simply smiled, a genuine expression that reached his eyes and made small crinkles appear at their corners. "I've got the wagon just over here," he said, gesturing down the street. "We can get your things loaded and head out to the ranch. It's about an hour's ride, but the weather's fair today." As they walked toward the wagon, Grace noticed people stopping to stare. An older woman actually backed away and made a sign against evil. Gerald noticed too, and his jaw tightened, but he said nothing, simply placed a gentle hand at the small of Grace's back, guiding her forward with quiet dignity. "Folks here can be superstitious," he said as he helped her up onto the wagon seat. His hands were strong and calloused but surprisingly gentle. "They'll warm up once they get to know you." Grace wanted to tell him that no, they wouldn't, that people never did, but she held her tongue. She had learned that arguing about her supposed curse only made people believe in it more fervently. The wagon seat creaked as Gerald climbed up beside her, and soon they were rolling out of town, heading west toward the mountains. The landscape was breathtaking, so different from anything Grace had known. Vast stretches of grassland gave way to rolling hills, and beyond them the mountains rose like sentinels, their peaks still touched with snow even in June. "It's beautiful," she said softly. "It is," Gerald agreed. "Harsh sometimes, especially in winter, but beautiful. The ranch is in a valley between those two peaks you see there. Good water, good grass. My father settled the land 20 years ago, and I've been building it up since he passed 5 years back." "I'm sorry for your loss," Grace said. Gerald glanced at her, and something in his expression softened. "Thank you, and I'm sorry for yours, all of them. That's a heavy burden to carry." The simple acknowledgement of her pain without judgment or fear nearly undid her. Grace felt tears prick at her eyes and had to look away, blinking them back. "People say I killed them," she whispered. "They say I'm cursed." "People say a lot of things," Gerald replied, his voice firm but kind. "Doesn't make them true. I read your letters, Grace. I heard the grief in your words." Nobody who wrote with that much pain could be anything but innocent of the tragedies that befell her. Grace turned to look at him, really look at him. His profile was strong, his attention focused on the horses and the road ahead, but there was a gentleness about him that contradicted his rugged appearance. "Why did you answer my advertisement? Surely there were other women without my reputation." Gerald was quiet for a moment, and Grace watched a hawk circle overhead while she waited for his answer. Finally, he spoke. "I've been alone for 5 years. Built up the ranch, worked from sunup to sundown, made something I'm proud of. But a ranch isn't a home without someone to share it with. I answered a few advertisements over the years, but the women who came out here, they took one look at the isolation, the hard work, the distance from civilization, and they got right back on the stage." He paused, adjusting his grip on the reins. "Then I read your letter. You weren't looking for comfort or ease. You were looking for a chance, a place to belong. That's all I'm looking for too. As for the curse," he turned to meet her eyes directly, "I'll take my chances. Every cowboy in the territory risks his neck every day anyway. Least I'd be risking it for something worth having." The sincerity in his words wrapped around Grace's heart like a warm blanket. She didn't know what to say, so she simply nodded and turned her attention back to the landscape, feeling something she hadn't felt in a very long time: hope. The ranch came into view as they crested a hill, and Grace caught her breath. It was nestled in a valley just as Gerald had described, with a creek running through it that sparkled in the afternoon sun. The main house was a sturdy log structure with a covered porch, and beyond it stood a barn, a bunkhouse, and several corrals. Cattle dotted the valley and horses grazed in a nearby pasture. "It's wonderful," Grace said. "It's home," Gerald replied simply. "Or at least, I hope it will be for you too." He pulled the wagon up to the house, and as he helped Grace down, a grizzled older man emerged from the barn. He had a pronounced limp and a weathered face that suggested he had seen more than his share of frontier life. "That's Dutch," Gerald said. "He's been with the ranch since my father's time. Dutch, this is Grace Turner." The old man looked Grace up and down with shrewd eyes, then spat tobacco juice into the dirt. "So you're the cursed bride everyone in town's talking about." "Dutch," Gerald's voice held a warning note. But Dutch waved him off. "Now hold on, boss. I'm just saying what everyone else is thinking." He turned back to Grace, and to her surprise, his weathered face split into a gap-toothed grin. "But I also think it's a load of horseshit, pardon my language, miss. Bad luck ain't the same as a curse. My wife, God rest her soul, she lost 4 babies before we had our son. Folks said she was cursed too. Sometimes life's just hard, that's all." Grace felt a rush of gratitude toward the old cowboy. "Thank you," she said quietly. Dutch nodded. "Welcome to the Sutton Ranch, Miss Turner. I hope you'll be happy here." As Dutch limped back toward the barn, Gerald carried Grace's bags up onto the porch. The door wasn't locked, Grace noticed. That was different from St. Louis, where everyone bolted their doors against thieves and worse. Inside, the house was simple but well built. The main room served as both kitchen and living area, with a stone fireplace dominating one wall. A table and chairs sat near the kitchen area, and a worn but comfortable-looking sofa faced the hearth. Doorways led to what Grace assumed were bedrooms. "It's not fancy," Gerald said, setting down her bags, "but it's solid. The bedroom on the right is yours. I've been using the one on the left. There's a pump out back for water, and the privy is behind the house. I know it's not what you're used to." "It's perfect," Grace said, and she meant it. The house felt warm and lived in, a real home rather than just a structure. "Thank you, Gerald." He shifted his weight, suddenly looking uncertain. "I want you to know I don't expect anything from you right away. I know we're strangers, regardless of the letters. We can take our time getting to know each other. There's no pressure for anything until you're ready." The respect in his words, the consideration for her feelings, touched Grace deeply. Every other marriage she had entered had been rushed, dictated by societal expectations and family pressure. Here was a man offering her time, offering her choice. "I appreciate that," she said. "I want to make this work, Gerald. I want to build a life here." He smiled, that warm expression that lit up his whole face. "Then we'll figure it out together. Now you must be tired and hungry. Let me show you where everything is, and then I'll rustle up some dinner." Over the next few hours, Gerald gave Grace a tour of the ranch. He introduced her to the horses, including his own mount, a big chestnut gelding named Copper. He showed her the chickens, explaining that collecting eggs would be one of her tasks if she was willing. He pointed out the garden plot that had gone largely untended since he had no time for it between ranch work. "I can manage the garden," Grace said eagerly. "I'm good with growing things." "Then it's all yours," Gerald replied. "Whatever you can coax out of this mountain soil, I'll be grateful for." They ate dinner as the sun set, painting the mountains in shades of gold and purple. Gerald had prepared a simple meal of beans, bacon, and cornbread, and they ate mostly in comfortable silence, both tired from the day. Occasionally, their eyes would meet across the table, and Grace would feel a flutter of something she couldn't quite name. After dinner, Gerald insisted on cleaning up while Grace settled into her room. It was small but cozy, with a bed covered in a colorful quilt, a dresser, and a window that looked out toward the mountains. Grace unpacked her few belongings, hanging her 2 other dresses in the small wardrobe and arranging her hairbrush, mirror, and the small bundle of letters from Gerald on the dresser. She sat on the bed and allowed herself to feel the exhaustion of the journey. But beneath the tiredness, there was something else, something she almost didn't dare acknowledge. For the first time in 2 years, she didn't feel like a harbinger of death. Gerald looked at her like she was a woman, not a curse. He spoke to her with respect and kindness. He made her feel almost normal again. A soft knock on the door interrupted her thoughts. "Grace, I wanted to make sure you had everything you need." She opened the door to find Gerald standing there, his hat in his hands. He had taken off his boots, she noticed, probably to avoid tracking dirt through the house. It was a small detail, but it spoke of consideration. I have everything, thank you, she said. Gerald, I want you to know how much I appreciate your kindness. You've made me feel welcome when I expected, well, something very different. He leaned against the doorframe, his expression serious. Grace, I won't pretend to understand what you've been through. Losing 3 husbands, carrying the weight of other people's superstition and blame, that's a burden I can't imagine. But I want you to know that here on this ranch, you're not cursed. You're not bad luck. You're just Grace, and that's enough. The tears Grace had been holding back all day finally spilled over. She wiped at them quickly, embarrassed, but Gerald's expression only grew more gentle. I'm sorry, she said. It's just that no one has said anything like that to me in so long. Then people have been fools, Gerald said firmly. Now get some rest. Tomorrow we can talk about how you want to settle in here, what you want your days to look like. There's no rush for anything. He started to turn away, then paused. Grace, I'm really glad you came. I know it took courage to come all this way to take a chance on a stranger. I'm going to do everything I can to make sure you never regret it. After he left, Grace lay in bed listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the Montana night. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote howled. The wind whispered through the valley, and the creek babbled its endless song. Despite everything she had been through, despite all the fear and grief she carried, Grace felt something unfurl in her chest. It felt dangerously like hope. The next morning, Grace woke to the sound of roosters crowing and sunlight streaming through her window. She dressed quickly in her work dress, a simple brown calico, and braided her dark hair. When she emerged from her room, she found the kitchen empty but a fire already going in the stove and coffee warming in a pot. Through the window, she could see Gerald working with a horse in the corral, his movements fluid and confident. Dutch stood nearby, offering occasional commentary. Grace poured herself a cup of coffee and stood watching, admiring the way Gerald handled the skittish young horse with patience and firmness. She was still watching when Gerald looked up and saw her in the window. He smiled and waved, and Grace felt that flutter again, stronger this time. She waved back, then set about exploring the kitchen, taking inventory of what supplies Gerald had and what meals she might be able to prepare. It was clear that Gerald had been living as a bachelor. The pantry held mostly basics: beans, flour, coffee, salt, sugar, and a few other staples. There was bacon hanging in the cool cellar and some preserved vegetables that looked like they had been purchased rather than home-canned. Grace made a mental list of what she would need from town and what she could potentially grow or make herself. By the time Gerald came in for breakfast, Grace had managed to put together a respectable meal of eggs from the henhouse, bacon, and biscuits. It wasn't fancy, but it was hot and filling. "This is wonderful," Gerald said after his first bite. "I've been living on my own cooking for so long, I'd forgotten what real food tastes like." "Your cooking last night was perfectly fine," Grace said, but she was pleased by the compliment. "I'm just glad I can contribute something." Over breakfast, they talked about the ranch. Gerald explained that he ran about 200 head of cattle and was hoping to expand the herd. He had 3 other hands who worked the ranch besides Dutch, but they were currently up in the high country moving cattle to summer pasture and wouldn't be back for another week. "That means it's just the 3 of us for now," Gerald said. "I hope you won't be too lonely. The nearest neighbor is about 5 miles east, a widow named Mrs. Peterson. She's a good woman, supplies some of the neighboring ranches with butter and cheese. I can take you to visit her once you're settled if you'd like." "I'd like that very much," Grace said. The prospect of having another woman to talk to, someone who might become a friend, was appealing. "As for town," Gerald continued, "we go in about once a month for supplies, more often if needed. I know yesterday was difficult with how people treated you. I want you to know I won't tolerate anyone being disrespectful to you. You're my wife, or you will be once we have the ceremony, and that means you deserve respect." The mention of the wedding ceremony brought a question to Grace's mind. "When were you thinking we should marry? The Reverend in town, will he be willing?" Gerald's expression darkened slightly. "Reverend Michaels is a good man, but he's easily swayed by his congregation. I was thinking we might go to Helena instead, to the territorial capital. It's a longer journey, but there's a justice of the peace there who can perform the ceremony. We could make a trip of it, maybe stay a night or two, let you see some of the territory." The thoughtfulness of the plan touched Grace. Gerald was trying to protect her from more judgment and ridicule while also giving her an opportunity to see more of her new home. "That sounds lovely. Good. We can plan to go in about 2 weeks, give you time to settle in here first. Dutch can watch the ranch for a few days." After breakfast, Grace threw herself into making the house more of a home. She cleaned thoroughly, washed curtains that hadn't been washed in who knew how long, and organized the kitchen to her liking. Gerald had given her permission to change anything she wanted, and she found herself enjoying the process of putting her stamp on the place. In the afternoon, she ventured out to the garden plot. It was overgrown with weeds, but the soil looked good, and the location had plenty of sun. She spent several hours clearing weeds and planning where she would plant various vegetables. It was too late for some crops, but she could still get in beans, squash, and possibly some late lettuce. She was so absorbed in her work that she didn't notice Gerald approaching until his shadow fell across her. She looked up to find him watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "You've been out here for hours," he said. "You should take a break, get some water." Grace wiped the sweat from her forehead and looked at the progress she had made. About half the plot was cleared. "I got carried away. It felt good to work with the soil again." Gerald reached down and offered her his hand. She took it, and he pulled her to her feet with easy strength. His hand was warm and calloused, and Grace was acutely aware of how close they were standing. "You're going to have blisters," he said, gently turning her hands over to examine her palms. Sure enough, red spots were forming where the hoe handle had rubbed. "Come on, let's get these tended." In the kitchen, Gerald pumped cool water over her hands, then carefully applied a salve he retrieved from a cabinet. His touch was gentle, his big hands surprisingly deft as he tended to her minor injuries. "I should have given you gloves," he said. "I wasn't thinking." "I should have thought to ask for them," Grace replied. "I'm used to working, Gerald. I'm not afraid of a few blisters." He looked up from her hands to meet her eyes. "I can see that, but that doesn't mean you have to suffer unnecessarily." He finished with the salve and carefully wrapped her palms in soft cloth. "There, give them a day to toughen up and you'll be fine." That evening they sat on the porch and watched the sun set over the mountains. Gerald brought out his guitar, an unexpected treasure, and played softly while the sky turned from gold to purple to deep blue. He wasn't a virtuoso, but he played with feeling, and his deep voice carried the melody of old folk songs that Grace vaguely recognized. "That was beautiful," she said when he finished. "I didn't know you played." "My mother taught me," Gerald said, running his hand over the worn wood of the instrument. "She said every home should have music in it. After she and my father passed, I kept playing. It helps, especially on the long winter nights." "Will you teach me?" Grace asked impulsively. "I always wanted to learn an instrument, but there was never time or money for lessons." Gerald's face lit up. "I'd like that. We could practice in the evenings when the work's done." Over the following days, a pattern emerged. Grace would wake early, prepare breakfast, and spend her mornings working on the house and garden. Gerald would work with the horses and cattle, mending fences, checking on his herd. They would meet for lunch, then returned to their respective tasks. Evenings were spent together, sometimes with Gerald teaching Grace basic guitar chords, sometimes just talking on the porch, watching the stars emerge. With each passing day, Grace felt herself relaxing more. The constant tension she had carried for 2 years was slowly easing. Gerald was unfailingly kind and respectful, never pushing her, never demanding more than she was ready to give. He treated her like a partner, asking her opinion on ranch matters, listening when she spoke about her ideas for improving the house or garden. Dutch, too, became a source of comfort. The old cowboy had a dry sense of humor and a wealth of stories about the early days of the territory. He treated Grace with grandfatherly affection, teaching her about the local plants and animals, showing her which herbs could be used for cooking or medicine. It was Dutch who first mentioned the upcoming dance in town. Gerald had just come in for lunch, and the three of them were sitting around the kitchen table eating the stew Grace had prepared. "There's a social coming up week after next," Dutch said casually. "Whole town turns out for it. Music, dancing, food. Good time for folks to get together." Gerald's expression closed off slightly. "We'll probably skip it this year, Dutch." "Now, why would you do that?" Dutch asked, though his tone suggested he knew perfectly well why. "Because Grace doesn't need to face a whole town of gossips and superstitious fools," Gerald said flatly. Grace set down her spoon and looked between the two men. "I appreciate you wanting to protect me, Gerald, but I can't hide from the town forever. If we're going to build a life here, I need to face people eventually." "They'll talk," Gerald said, his voice tight. "They'll whisper and point." "They've been doing that my whole life," Grace replied. "I'm used to it. Besides, if I never show my face, people will make me into more of a monster than they already think I am. At least if they see me, see that I'm just a woman, maybe some of them will realize how foolish their superstitions are." Dutch nodded approvingly. "The girl's got a point, boss. Can't let fear run your life." Gerald looked at Grace for a long moment, then sighed. "Are you sure? I don't want you to feel pressured." "I'm sure," Grace said, though her stomach fluttered nervously at the thought. "We can go together. You promised to teach me to dance, remember?" "From that letter you wrote," a slow smile spread across Gerald's face. "I did promise that, didn't I? All right then. We'll go to the social. But if anyone says one word out of line, we're leaving." The week and a half before the dance passed quickly. True to his word, Gerald taught Grace to dance in the evenings, moving the table aside to clear space in the main room. He was surprisingly graceful for such a large man, and patient with Grace as she learned the steps of various dances popular in the territory. "You're a natural," he said as they waltzed around the room to his humming. His hand was warm on her waist, and Grace found herself very aware of his nearness, the masculine scent of him, leather and soap and something uniquely Gerald. "I have a good teacher," she replied, looking up at him. Their eyes met, and for a moment the air between them seemed to thicken. Gerald's hand tightened slightly on her waist, and Grace felt her breath catch. Then the moment passed, and Gerald stepped back, clearing his throat. "I think you're ready for the social," he said, his voice slightly rougher than usual. The night before the dance, Grace lay in bed unable to sleep. She was nervous about facing the town, yes, but there was something else keeping her awake. Over the past 2 weeks, her feelings for Gerald had deepened. She found herself looking forward to meals together, to their evening conversations, to any moment she could steal watching him work. She admired his strength and kindness, his patience and humor. When he smiled at her, her heart raced. When he touched her hand or placed his palm at the small of her back, she felt a warmth spread through her entire body. She was falling in love with him, she realized. The thought was terrifying. Every man she had loved had died. What if the curse was real? What if her feelings for Gerald doomed him too? But another part of her, a part that was growing stronger with each day on the ranch, whispered that Gerald was right. There was no curse. There was only bad luck, terrible coincidences, and her own unfounded guilt. She couldn't let fear rob her of the chance at real happiness. The next morning, Grace dressed in her best gown, a deep green silk that had been her wedding dress when she married Charles. She had altered it since, removing some of the more elaborate trim and making it more suitable for everyday wear, but it was still the nicest thing she owned. She arranged her dark hair in a style she had seen in a ladies' magazine, pinning it up with the few decorative combs she had. When she emerged from her room, Gerald was waiting in the main room, and the look on his face made her blush. He was staring at her with undisguised admiration, his eyes traveling from her face to her dress and back again. "Grace," he said, his voice low, "you look absolutely beautiful." "Thank you," she said, smoothing down her skirt self-consciously. "You clean up rather well yourself." Gerald was wearing a pressed white shirt with a string tie, dark trousers, and a vest. He had trimmed his hair and shaved, and Grace thought he looked devastatingly handsome. He crossed the room and offered her his arm. "Whatever happens today, we face it together," he said. "Agreed, agreed," Grace replied, taking his arm and drawing strength from his solid presence. The ride to town was quiet, both of them lost in their own thoughts. As they approached Deer Lodge, Grace could hear music drifting on the afternoon air. The social was being held in the town square, with a small platform set up for the musicians and tables arranged around the edges laden with food brought by various townspeople. When they arrived, conversation didn't stop exactly, but it definitely quieted. People turned to stare as Gerald helped Grace down from the wagon. She held her head high and kept her hand on Gerald's arm, determined not to show any fear. Reverend Michaels was the first to approach, his wife trailing behind him. The Reverend was a thin, nervous man with pale eyes that darted around constantly. "Gerald, good to see you, and this must be Miss Turner." "Soon to be Mrs. Sutton," Gerald said firmly. "We're traveling to Helena next week for the ceremony." "I see," Reverend Michaels said, exchanging a glance with his wife. "Well, I hope you'll both be very happy." The words were polite, but Grace could hear the doubt beneath them. "Mrs." Michaels hadn't said anything at all, just looked at Grace with wide, fearful eyes. Other people approached, driven by curiosity more than friendliness. Gerald stayed close to Grace's side, his presence a shield against the worst of the whispers. Some people were kind, offering genuine congratulations. Others were coolly polite, their skepticism evident. A few made signs against evil when they thought Grace wasn't looking. It was Mrs. Peterson, the widow Gerald had mentioned, who became their salvation. She was a round, cheerful woman in her 50s with white hair and kind eyes. She bustled over with a basket of food and a no-nonsense expression. "Gerald Sutton, you bring your young lady over to my table right now," she commanded. "I want to meet this girl properly, not in a crowd of gossiping hens." Gerald grinned, the tension in his shoulders easing slightly. "Yes, madam. Grace, this is Mrs. Peterson. Fair warning, she's the bossiest woman in the territory. And you're the most impertinent cowboy, Mrs." Peterson shot back, but she was smiling. She turned to Grace and took both her hands, examining her face closely. "So you're the one everyone's calling cursed. You don't look cursed to me. You look like a girl who's had some hard luck and could use a friend." The simple kindness in her words made Grace's throat tight with emotion. "Thank you," she managed. "Now, let's get some food in you both, and then you can introduce me to this young lady properly, Gerald. I want to know all about her." They spent the next hour at Mrs. Peterson's table, and the older woman's acceptance of Grace seemed to ease the tension among some of the other townspeople. A few younger women even approached to introduce themselves, curiosity overcoming their fear. Grace began to relax, to think that perhaps the afternoon wouldn't be the ordeal she had anticipated. Then the music started, and Gerald stood, offering Grace his hand. "May I have this dance?" "You may," Grace said, placing her hand in his and letting him lead her to the dancing area. As they began to waltz, Grace was aware of people watching them, but for once, she didn't care. Gerald's arm was strong around her waist, his hand warm in hers, and when she looked up at him, the way he was looking at her made the rest of the world fade away. "You're doing beautifully," he murmured. "I have a good partner," she replied. They danced 3 more dances, and with each one, Grace felt Gerald pulling her a little closer, felt herself leaning into him a little more. The attraction that had been building between them was impossible to ignore. Grace could see it reflected in Gerald's eyes, feel it in the way his thumb stroked absently across her waist, sense it in the way his gaze kept dropping to her lips. They were halfway through a reel when a commotion broke out near the food tables. A man, clearly drunk despite it being early afternoon, was shouting and pointing at Grace. "That's her. That's the cursed woman. She'll bring death to this whole town. 3 men dead already, and that fool Cowboy will be next." Gerald's expression turned thunderous. He released Grace and started toward the drunk man, but Grace caught his arm. "Don't. He's not worth it." "He's insulting you," Gerald said, his voice dangerously low. "Let me handle it," Grace said. Before Gerald could stop her, she walked straight toward the drunk man. He was being restrained by 2 other men, but he continued to shout accusations. Grace stopped directly in front of him and spoke in a clear, carrying voice that silenced the crowd. "You're right. I've been married 3 times, and all 3 men died. My first husband's horse threw him and broke his neck. My second husband caught pneumonia during a terrible winter and never recovered. My third husband was struck by lightning while working in the fields. If you believe I caused any of those things, if you believe I have the power to control horses, weather, and acts of God, then you're giving me far more credit than I deserve." She paused, looking around at the gathered crowd. "I'm just a woman. I've suffered loss and grief, and I've been blamed for things beyond my control. If that makes me cursed in your eyes, so be it. But I will not apologize for surviving. I will not apologize for seeking happiness. And I will not hide away because my presence makes some of you uncomfortable." The silence that followed was absolute. The drunk man had stopped shouting, staring at Grace with bleary confusion. Then Mrs. Peterson began to clap. Slowly, others joined in until more than half the crowd was applauding. Not everyone, Grace noticed. Some people still looked at her with fear and suspicion. But enough people were showing support that the tide had turned. Gerald appeared at her side, pride evident in his expression. He took her hand and raised it to his lips, kissing her knuckles right there in front of everyone. "That's my blessing," he said loudly enough for those nearby to hear. "Not a curse, a blessing." The words sent a wave of warmth through Grace's entire body. Gerald's blessing. The phrase seemed to resonate with something deep inside her. They stayed for another hour at the social, dancing and talking with the people brave enough to approach them. By the time they loaded back into the wagon to return to the ranch, Grace was exhausted but exhilarated. "You were magnificent today," Gerald said, as they rode through the gathering dusk. "The way you faced down that drunk fool, the way you spoke to the crowd. You're the bravest person I've ever met." "I'm not brave," Grace said. "I'm just tired of being afraid." "Sometimes that's the same thing," Gerald replied. They rode in comfortable silence for a while, the wagon creaking rhythmically, and the horses' hooves clopping on the hard, packed road. The The stars were beginning to emerge, brilliant against the darkening sky. Grace found herself acutely aware of Gerald beside her, of the warmth of his body in the cooling evening air. "Grace," Gerald said suddenly, pulling the wagon to a stop. "There's something I need to say, and I can't wait any longer to say it." Grace's heart began to pound. "What is it?" Gerald turned to face her fully, taking both her hands in his. "These past 2 weeks have been the best of my life. Having you at the ranch, talking with you, teaching you to dance, working beside you, it's made me realize something. I didn't ask you here just because I needed a wife to help run the ranch. I asked you here because your letters moved me, because I sensed in you a kindred spirit. And now that you're here, now that I've gotten to know you, I find myself falling in love with you." Grace's breath caught. "Gerald, let me finish," he said gently. "I know we agreed to take things slow to give you time, and I'll honor that for as long as you need. But I also need you to know that when I look at you, I don't see a curse. I see a woman of strength and grace, someone who's endured terrible losses and come out stronger. I see the woman I want to spend the rest of my life with, however long or short that may be. You're my blessing, Grace. You're my blessing." Tears were streaming down Grace's face now, but they were tears of joy. "I love you too," she whispered. "I've been so afraid to say it, so afraid that loving you would doom you somehow, but I can't help it. I love you, Gerald Sutton. I love your kindness and your strength. I love the way you treat me like I matter. I love the way you make me feel safe. I love you." Gerald cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs wiping away her tears. "Then will you marry me? Not because of an arrangement or a contract, but because we choose each other." "Yes," Grace said, and then again, stronger, "Yes, I'll marry you." Gerald leaned in slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wanted, but Grace didn't want to pull away. She wanted this, wanted him, with an intensity that took her breath away. When his lips met hers, it was gentle at first, tentative, a question. Grace answered by wrapping her arms around his neck and kissing him back with all the longing she had been suppressing. The kiss deepened, becoming more passionate, and Grace felt alive in a way she never had before. This wasn't duty or obligation or societal expectation. This was choice. This was love. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Gerald rested his forehead against hers. "I want to do this right," he said. "I want to marry you properly in Helena, and then bring you home as my wife in every way. Can you wait another week?" "I can wait," Grace said, though every fiber of her being was crying out for more of his kisses, more of his touch. "But only if you promise to kiss me like that again." Gerald laughed, a joyful sound that echoed across the valley. "I promise to kiss you like that every day for the rest of our lives." The week leading up to their trip to Helena was both wonderful and torturous. Grace and Gerald had crossed a threshold, and now the attraction between them was undeniable and constant. They would brush past each other in the kitchen and pause, caught in the magnetic pull between them. Grace would look up from her gardening to find Gerald watching her with heat in his eyes. They kissed on the porch in the evenings, long, deep kisses that left them both shaking with need, but Gerald held to his word. He wanted to marry her properly before taking things further. Dutch watched their courtship with amusement. "You two are so lovesick, it's painful to watch," he said one morning at breakfast. "Best get to Helena and get hitched before you both spontaneously combust." Grace blushed furiously, but Gerald just grinned. "Working on it, Dutch." Finally, the day came for them to depart for Helena. They would take the stage part of the way and hire horses for the rest, with plans to stay in the capital for 3 days. Grace packed her few belongings, including the green dress she would wear for the ceremony, and tried to calm her racing heart. The journey to Helena took the better part of 2 days, with an overnight stop at a way station. Gerald arranged for separate rooms, always the gentleman, though Grace could see the strain it cost him. They spent the evening sitting close together on a bench outside the station, talking about their future. "I want children," Gerald said quietly. "If you're willing. I know that might be frightening given your history, but I want a family with you." Grace had thought about this too, had worried about it in the dark of night. What if the curse extended to her children? What if she brought death to any child she bore? But looking at Gerald's hopeful face, feeling the love that had blossomed between them, she pushed the fear aside. "I want children too," she said. "I want to fill that ranch house with life and laughter. I want to build something lasting with you." Gerald kissed her then, tender and sweet, and Grace felt her fears receding even further. Helena was larger and busier than Deer Lodge, a real city with proper streets and buildings. Gerald led Grace to a small but respectable hotel, where he again procured separate rooms, and the next morning they went to the courthouse. The justice of the peace was an older man with a kind face who asked no questions about Grace's past. The ceremony was simple but meaningful. Grace wore her green dress, and Gerald had purchased a new shirt and tie for the occasion. They stood before the justice and spoke their vows, and when Gerald slipped a simple gold band onto Grace's finger, tears of joy streamed down her face. "I now pronounce you man and wife," the justice said. "You may kiss your bride." Gerald cupped Grace's face in his hands and kissed her thoroughly, not caring that they had an audience. When they finally broke apart, both were grinning like fools. "Mrs. Sutton," Gerald said, testing out the name. "Mr. Sutton," Grace replied, loving the sound of it. They spent the afternoon exploring Helena, walking hand in hand through the streets. Gerald bought Grace a beautiful blue shawl from a shop, insisting she needed something to remember the day by. They ate dinner at a proper restaurant, and Gerald held her hand across the table, his thumb tracing circles on her palm that made her shiver with anticipation. Finally, as the sun set and the streets began to empty, Gerald led Grace back to the hotel. But instead of stopping at her door as he had the night before, he led her to his room. Once inside, with the door closed behind them, he turned to her, his expression serious. "Are you sure about this?" he asked. "We can wait longer if you need to." Grace stepped close to him and placed her hand over his heart, feeling it thunder beneath her palm. "I'm sure. I love you, Gerald. I want to be your wife in every way." What followed was tender and passionate, a joining that felt like coming home. Gerald was patient and gentle, ensuring Grace's comfort even as his own need was evident. When they finally came together, it felt right in a way nothing ever had before. Afterward, they lay tangled together in the hotel bed, Grace's head on Gerald's chest, his arm wrapped securely around her. "I love you," Gerald murmured into her hair. "My blessing." "I love you too," Grace replied, pressing a kiss to his chest. "My heart." They stayed in Helena for 2 more days, and Grace thought she had never been happier. They explored the city during the days and returned to their room each evening, learning each other's bodies, building a physical intimacy that matched the emotional connection they had already forged. On the 3rd day, as they prepared to return to the ranch, Gerald gave Grace a small package wrapped in brown paper. "Open it," he urged. Inside was a beautiful leather-bound journal and a set of pencils. "For writing," Gerald explained. "I loved your letters so much, and I thought maybe you'd like to write about our life together. Keep a record of our days. Maybe someday our children or grandchildren will want to read about how their family began." The thoughtfulness of the gift touched Grace deeply. She threw her arms around Gerald's neck. "It's perfect. Thank you." The journey back to the ranch felt different now. Grace was returning not as a mail-order bride or a guest, but as Gerald's wife, as Mrs. Sutton. When they finally crested the hill and saw the valley spread out before them, she felt a swell of emotion. This was home now, truly home. Dutch was waiting on the porch when they arrived, and he let out a whoop when he saw them. "About time you two made it official. Congratulations." The other ranch hands had returned from the high country while they were gone, and Gerald introduced Grace to them. Jack was a young cowboy, maybe 20, with a quick smile and an easy manner. Frank was older, quiet and serious, and seemed to be Dutch's closest friend. The third hand was a Mexican man named Miguel who spoke excellent English, but preferred to communicate through actions rather than words. All three men treated Grace with respect, tipping their hats and welcoming her to the ranch. If they had heard the rumors about her being cursed, they gave no sign of it. Life settled into a rhythm over the following weeks. Grace thrived in her role as Gerald's wife and the keeper of their home. Her garden flourished, producing more vegetables than they could eat, so she began preserving the excess for winter. She learned to churn butter and make cheese under Mrs. Peterson's tutelage, the older woman having become a frequent visitor and dear friend. The ranch prospered too. Gerald's careful management and hard work paid off as the cattle fattened on summer grass and new calves thrived. He was training horses on the side as well, and word of his skill was spreading. People began coming from neighboring ranches to have him work with their difficult mounts. Grace loved watching Gerald work with horses. He had an almost magical way with them, patient and calm, able to understand what each animal needed. She would sometimes bring him lunch in the corral and stay to watch, perched on the fence rail, marveling at her husband's skill. Their love continued to deepen. Gerald was an attentive and passionate husband, and Grace bloomed under his care. The fears she had carried for so long continued to recede. Gerald was healthy and strong, thriving, not cursed by his association with her at all. As summer turned to autumn, painting the mountains in shades of gold and crimson, Grace began to believe that perhaps her curse had never been real, that she could have happiness without bringing tragedy. It was in late September that Grace realized she was with child. She had missed her monthly courses twice, and the nausea that plagued her in the mornings was unmistakable. Joy and terror warred within her. She wanted Gerald's child desperately, but the fear lingered. What if the curse touched this innocent life? She was working in the kitchen, trying to settle her roiling stomach with peppermint tea when Gerald came in for lunch. He took one look at her pale face and was immediately concerned. "Grace, are you all right? You look unwell." Grace set down her teacup with trembling hands. "Gerald, I need to tell you something. I'm going to have a baby." For a moment, Gerald just stared at her, his expression unreadable. Then his face split into the biggest smile Grace had ever seen. He let out a whoop of joy and swept her up in his arms, spinning her around before carefully setting her back on her feet. "A baby," he said, his voice filled with wonder. He placed his hand gently on her still flat stomach. "Our baby." "You're not worried?" Grace asked. "About the curse, about something happening?" Gerald's expression grew serious. He cupped her face in his hands. "Grace, my love, there is no curse. There never was. You're going to have a healthy pregnancy, and we're going to have a beautiful child, and we're going to raise that child together in this home filled with love. Do you hear me? I'm not going to die. Our baby is going to be fine. You're my blessing, remember." Grace felt tears spill down her cheeks. "I'm scared," she whispered. "I know," Gerald said gently. "But we'll face this together like we face everything. You're not alone anymore." The pregnancy progressed well, though Grace's fears never completely disappeared. Gerald was endlessly patient with her worries, reassuring her constantly. He became even more protective. insisting she not lift anything heavy, not overwork herself. He would place his hand on her growing belly and talk to their child, telling stories about the ranch and promising all the adventures they would have together. Mrs. Peterson became a godsend during this time, sharing her wisdom from having raised 3 children of her own. She promised to be there for the birth, and her calm confidence helped ease Grace's anxiety. Winter came to the Montana territory with fierce cold and heavy snows. Grace was grateful for the sturdy house and the stockpile of firewood Gerald had prepared. They spent long evenings by the fire, with Gerald reading aloud or playing his guitar, Grace knitting small garments for the baby while her belly swelled with new life. On a frigid February night, with snow piled high around the ranch house and the wind howling outside, Grace's labor began. Gerald rode through the storm to fetch Mrs. Peterson, and the older woman arrived with her supplies and her no-nonsense manner. "Now then," she said, removing her snow-covered cloak, "let's bring this baby into the world." The labor was long and difficult. Grace had never known such pain, and through it all the fear whispered in the back of her mind. What if something went wrong? What if the curse was real after all? But Gerald never left her side. He held her hand, wiped her brow, whispered words of love and encouragement. "You can do this, Grace. You're the strongest person I know. Our baby is going to be fine. You're going to be fine. I love you so much." As dawn broke over the mountains, painting the snow-covered valley in shades of pink and gold, Grace gave one final push, and the sound of a baby's cry filled the room. Mrs. Peterson worked quickly, and moments later, she placed a squirming bundle in Grace's arms. "You have a son," she said with a smile. "A healthy, perfect son." Grace looked down at the tiny face, the small hands waving in the air, and felt love crash over her like a wave. Their son. He was real and alive and perfect. Gerald leaned over them both, his face wet with tears. "He's beautiful," Gerald said, his voice choked with emotion. "Just like his mother." "What should we name him?" Grace asked. Gerald touched his son's tiny hand, and the baby's fingers immediately curled around his father's much larger finger. "I was thinking George, after my father." "George Sutton. What do you think, George?" Grace said, testing the name. "It's perfect." Over the next weeks, as Grace recovered and they adjusted to life with a newborn, the last of Grace's fears finally faded. George was thriving. A healthy, happy baby with his father's eyes and his mother's dark hair. Gerald was completely besotted with his son, spending every spare moment holding him, talking to him, showing him around the ranch. "He's going to be a fine rancher someday," Gerald would say, walking with George around the house, pointing out various features. "This is where your mother's garden is, and that's the barn where the horses live. Someday you'll learn to ride and we'll check the herd together." Grace would watch her husband with their son and feel her heart swell with more love than she thought possible. This was the life she had dreamed of but never believed she could have. A home, a family, a husband who loved her, a healthy child. Spring came again to the valley, and with it came a letter. Gerald brought it in from town one day, a puzzled expression on his face. "It's from St. Louis," he said. "From a lawyer." Grace's heart sank. What now? But when she opened the letter and read it, she discovered unexpected news. Her aunt, her mother's sister and the only remaining family Grace had passed away. She had left Grace a modest inheritance, enough money to make real improvements to the ranch. "I'm sorry for your loss," Gerald said, though he knew Grace had never been close to the woman. "But this money, Grace, this could help us expand the ranch, maybe build a bigger house, add on rooms for our growing family." "Our growing family?" Grace asked, raising an eyebrow. Gerald grinned. "Well, I was hoping George might have brothers and sisters eventually." Unless you think one is enough, Grace laughed. I think I could be persuaded to give George some siblings. They used the inheritance wisely, adding on to the house and investing in more cattle. The ranch continued to prosper. Word spread about the ranch in the valley, about the cursed bride who had brought nothing but blessings to Gerald Sutton's land. People started to revise their opinions. Perhaps they had been wrong about Grace Turner, Grace Sutton now. Perhaps the tragedies in her past had just been terrible luck, nothing more. 2 years after George's birth, Grace gave birth to a daughter they named Sarah. She was a tiny, delicate baby with her mother's features, and George was immediately protective of his little sister. 2 years after that, another son arrived, whom they named Thomas in honor of Grace's first husband, finally able to remember him without pain. The house that had once been a quiet bachelor's dwelling now rang with the sounds of children playing, of laughter and occasional tears, of life being lived fully. Dutch, now very old but still stubbornly working, delighted in the children, teaching George to whittle and telling all 3 of them outrageous stories about the old days. Mrs. Peterson became like a grandmother to the children, and her farmhouse became a second home. The town of Deer Lodge, seeing the obvious happiness and prosperity of the Sutton family, finally abandoned their superstitions about Grace. She became a respected member of the community, known for her kindness, her excellent preserves, and her devotion to her family. On their 5th wedding anniversary, Gerald surprised Grace by planning a trip back to Helena, leaving the children with Mrs. Peterson and Dutch. They stayed in the same hotel where they had spent their wedding night, and it felt both nostalgic and new. On their last evening in the city, they walked along the main street as the sun set, hand in hand like they had done 5 years before. Gerald stopped in front of a jewelry store and pulled Grace inside. He purchased a necklace for her, a delicate gold chain with a small pendant shaped like a mountain. "To remind you of home," he said as he fastened it around her neck. "Not that you need reminding. But I wanted you to have something beautiful, something that represents this life we've built together." Grace touched the pendant, tears in her eyes. "I love it. But Gerald, you didn't need to do this. You've already given me everything." Gerald pulled her close, right there in the jewelry store, not caring who might see. "You're wrong. You're the one who gave me everything. Before you came, I had a ranch, but it wasn't a home. I had land and cattle, but I was lonely. You brought life and love and laughter. You gave me children and happiness. You're my blessing, Grace. You always will be." Grace kissed him, pouring 5 years of love and gratitude into it. "And you're mine," she whispered against his lips. "You saw me when everyone else saw only a curse. You loved me when I couldn't love myself. You gave me a home and a family and a future. I love you, Gerald Sutton." "I love you too, Grace Sutton," Gerald replied, "for the rest of my life and beyond." They returned to the ranch the next day, and as they crested the hill and saw the valley spread out before them, saw the house where their children waited, saw the land they had built into a thriving ranch, Grace felt a peace settle over her that she had never known before. The curse was broken, not through any magic or ritual, but through love and determination and the simple act of choosing to believe in happiness. Grace had been called cursed, but Gerald had said she was his blessing, and in saying it, in believing it, he had made it true. Years passed, and the Sutton Ranch became one of the most successful in the territory. George grew into a strong, capable young man who shared his father's gift with horses. Sarah proved to have her mother's green thumb and turned the garden into a showpiece. Thomas was the dreamer of the family, always with his nose in a book or sketching the mountains. Dutch eventually passed away peacefully in his sleep at the age of 78, and they buried him on a hill overlooking the valley he had loved. The other hand stayed on, becoming like family themselves. Frank eventually married a widow from town and built a small house on ranch land. Miguel returned to Mexico for a visit and came back with a bride, and they too settled on the ranch. When Montana achieved statehood in 1889, Gerald and Grace traveled to the celebrations with their children, proud to be part of the territory's transformation. They had been there for the rough frontier days, and now they were part of a new state, a new era. Grace never stopped writing in the journal Gerald had given her. She filled volume after volume with the story of their life together, the daily small moments and the major milestones. She wrote about the first time George rode a horse alone, about Sarah's first attempts at cooking, about Thomas learning to read. She wrote about the harsh winters and the glorious summers, about cattle drives and harvest times, about visits with Mrs. Peterson and trips to town. She wrote about her husband, the man who had saved her not with sword or gun but with kindness and belief. She wrote about how his love had healed wounds she thought would never close, how his faith in her had given her faith in herself. On their 20th wedding anniversary, their children now grown or nearly so, Gerald arranged a party. Half the county came, it seemed, filling the expanded house and spilling out onto the property. People brought food and gifts, and there was music and dancing late into the night. Grace stood on the porch at one point, watching the festivities, and Gerald came to stand beside her, slipping his arm around her waist in a gesture that had become as natural as breathing. "Happy?" he asked. "More than I ever thought possible," Grace replied, leaning into him. "When I stepped off that stagecoach 20 years ago, I was so scared, so convinced that I was doomed to bring tragedy wherever I went. And look at this. Look at what we've built." Gerald kissed her temple. "We built it together. And we'll keep building it together, for as long as we both shall live." Grace turned in his arms to face him fully. At 42, she had a few silver threads in her dark hair, and lines had formed around her eyes. But Gerald still looked at her like she was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. He was 47 now, his hair graying at the temples, his face more weathered, but still strong and vital. "I used to be called cursed," Grace said softly, reaching up to cup his cheek. "But you called me your blessing." "You are my blessing," Gerald replied. "You always have been, from the moment you stepped off that stage with your chin up and your eyes defiant. You're my blessing, my love, my heart, my home." They kissed then, 20 years of love and partnership in that single gesture, and Grace knew with absolute certainty that the curse had never been real. What was real was this: the life they had chosen, the love they had nurtured, the family they had created. Over the years that followed, they watched their children grow and start families of their own. George married a rancher's daughter from a neighboring spread and took over more of the ranch operations as Gerald began to slow down. Sarah married a young lawyer from Helena and moved to the city, though she visited often with her growing brood of children. Thomas shocked everyone by deciding to become a teacher, and he opened a school in Deer Lodge, teaching the next generation of Montana children. Grace and Gerald became grandparents many times over, and their house was always full of visiting children and grandchildren. Mrs. Peterson lived to see many of those grandchildren, finally passing peacefully at the age of 86, and Grace mourned her like the mother she had never really had. As they entered their 60s, Grace and Gerald began to slow down, letting the younger generation take over more of the work. They spent their days in quieter pursuits, tending a smaller garden, taking gentle rides through the valley, sitting on the porch in the evenings watching the sun set over the mountains that had witnessed their entire life together. Gerald still played his guitar, his fingers not as nimble as they once were, but still able to coax beautiful music from the instrument. Grace still wrote in her journals, now chronicling the lives of their grandchildren and great-grandchildren. On a warm summer evening in 1918, when they had been married for 40 years, Grace and Gerald sat on their porch watching the sun paint the mountains gold. They were both 70 years old, their hair white, their movements slow, but their love as strong as ever. 40 years, Grace mused, her hand in Gerald's. 40 years since you met me at that stage and looked at me with kindness instead of fear. Best decision I ever made, Gerald replied. Answering your advertisement, taking a chance on the woman everyone called cursed. I was never cursed, Grace said. I just had bad luck until I met you, then everything changed. Gerald squeezed her hand. We changed it together. We made our own luck, our own blessings. They sat in comfortable silence, watching the stars emerge one by one. Somewhere in the house behind them, they could hear George talking with his wife, their voices a comforting murmur. Tomorrow, Sarah would arrive with her family for a visit. Thomas had promised to bring his students by next week to hear Gerald tell stories about the old frontier days. No regrets. Gerald asked, turning to look at Grace in the fading light. Not a single one, Grace replied. You, my love, were everything I never knew I was allowed to want. You gave me a life beyond my wildest dreams. You did the same for me, Gerald said. I was just a lonely cowboy with a ranch before you. You made me a husband, a father, a grandfather. You made me complete. They sat together as the night deepened and the stars blazed overhead. Two people who had found each other against all odds, who had built a life and a legacy that would endure long after they were gone. Grace thought about the girl she had been, stepping off that stage coach with fear in her heart and curses following her name. That girl could never have imagined the woman she would become, the life she would lead, the love she would know. Gerald had called her his blessing, and in doing so, he had transformed her. He had seen past the superstition and fear to the woman beneath, had chosen to believe in her when no one else would. That belief had given her the strength to believe in herself, to build a life worth living, to become more than the curse that had defined her. As they finally rose to go inside for the night, their movements slow but still graceful together after decades of partnership, Grace looked around at the ranch one more time. The house where they had raised their children, the barn where Gerald had worked his magic with horses, the mountains that stood eternal watch over their valley. This was home. This was love. This was the life they had chosen and built together. The mail-order bride who had been called cursed had found her place, had found her person, had found her purpose. And the cowboy who had said, "You're my blessing," had proven that sometimes faith and love are stronger than any curse, that kindness can transform lives, that two lonely people can find each other even in the vast wilderness of the Montana Territory and create something beautiful and lasting. Grace Sutton fell asleep that night in her husband's arms, just as she had for 40 years, and she knew with absolute certainty that she was blessed beyond measure. The curse was nothing but a distant memory, a shadow dispelled by the brilliant light of love and family and home. And in the morning, when the sun rose over the mountains once more, illuminating the valley where the Sutton Ranch thrived, it would shine on a testament to the power of love to overcome fear, of faith to dispel superstition, of two hearts finding each other and choosing, every single day, to build something beautiful together.